Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Andrea Giraldo. Welcome to Meetings of the Minds, brought to you by the New York City Hispanic Chamber of Commerce in partnership with BronxNet. This show was created in direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic as a way to highlight the work of our members and partners, as well as to understand the resources they have to help our community in those difficult times. Today, we have a special roundtable discussion on real estate in New York State for 2024. It will be hosted by Gregory Tsougranis, the real estate chairman of the New York City Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Joining him for today's discussion will be Stephen Pertinack, real estate associate broker for the Pertinack Real Estate team, and Elliot J. Cherson, Esquire, a top legal attorney and senior founding partner of Hertz, Cherson, and Rosenthal, PC. We hope you enjoyed this discussion. Gentlemen, take it away.
All right, thank you, Andrea, for that great introduction. I just want to say to Nick Lugo and Cindy, it is a pleasure to be part of the New York City Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Today I have two great individuals who embody great real estate practices here in the Bronx. I have Stephen Pertinack, second generation real estate family. I love the story that your father started you out just bagging the garbage as a child, and you've gone on to become a broker at Keller Williams. You also have owned, sold, developed, so you're here in order to tell us a lot of the practical aspects of the legislation that's proposed and just the state of real estate here today. And then Elliot Cherson, I know him because we're both board members from the Bronx chapter of HGAR, which is one of the real estate MLS services out there that is active in making sure that we have a healthy real estate environment. All right, so I'm going to bring up a couple of topics today. And first of all, I do want to thank you for coming. If there's anything you want to add on or anything, you're more than welcome to start the conversation also. Okay. A lot of the headlines that we're seeing now are dealing with distressed markets in the rent-stabilized buildings. And I think this is an important topic to discuss because a lot of the people who live in the Bronx and in the inner cities, a lot of the minorities, a lot of the Latinos out there, they're not just renters. They're also property owners. And when I see headlines like, for example, plummeting values of rent-stabilized housing crisis, when I hear headlines in The Real Deal, distress in rent-stabilized buildings rise to surface. The city said tens of thousands of rent-stabilized apartments remain off-market during the record housing shortage. And then I have curbs that are asking the question, or my first question to you, which is, are the landlords bluffing? So Steve, as a second-generation landlord, what are you seeing out there, and what are some of the issues that you need to bring to the table for the general public to hear? Because oftentimes you hear the tenant side, but the landlord side is sometimes muffled. So, I mean, what is it that you think is an important topic for us to discuss? Where should we start?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I think the most important place to start is just simple economics, right? Like if you're running a business, whether it's a property or whether it's a deli, grocery, or any sort of business, the income has to exceed the expenses. And when you don't have a way to do that, that business fails. In our case, or what we're talking about right now, is we're talking about property owners whose expenses are continuing to rise, but they have no way to raise the income so that way they can meet those expenses. And what happens in those cases, because we're talking about large apartment buildings, in some cases, hundreds and thousands of families are affected if that property owner is not able to run his business and make a profit or at least cover the expenses, which is really what's happening. You're very well aware of the foreclosure situations, and essentially if the owner can't afford to pay the expenses, a foreclosure proceeding would happen, and then what happens is the courts may put a receiver to manage that property. And usually the receivers that manage the property with great intentions, they don't have the funds either to run the building. So what happens is those buildings, the quality of life there, suffering. So at the end of the day, the protecting the tenants actually might end up having an adverse effect and hurting the tenants.
Okay, so there has to be a healthy balance between landlord and tenant.
I think so, yeah.
Okay,
I mean,
and one of the issues that I think is a major concern, and Hagar actually has a proposal out, is that we're seeing that good landlords that are accepting vouchers and abiding by the law are being denied insurance on their buildings, right? And or seeing 30–40% increases in their insurance. So as a rent stabilized building, I mean, can you tell us something about the Rent Stabilization Act and how it works? But basically, your rents are capped.
Yes, yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it very much. And yes, rents are capped on rent-stabilized buildings, which are basically buildings that were built prior to 1974. And the rents are, the annual rent increases are set by rent guidelines boards. New York City has one, and surrounding suburban counties have them as well. I'm on the Westchester County Rent Guidelines Board as an owner representative, as a matter of fact. The increases that the RGBs have passed over the past, well, certainly before COVID and during COVID and post-COVID, do not meet the minimum needed by landlords in order to maintain their buildings in the proper way. Prior to 2019 changes in the law, HISPA, landlords had different ways to maximize the monies that come into the building. For example, if a tenant vacated the building, then that apartment could be renovated and be rented for a market rent. But it had to be done properly, etc. Now, what happened is that the New York State legislature, and signed by the governor, eliminated any increases whatsoever for a vacant apartment. And what does that have resulted in? And we all know about the housing crisis in New York City. There certainly is a need for thousands and thousands of affordable apartments. And what's happened, unfortunately, is that there is no incentive whatsoever for a landlord who had a, let's say, grandma was living there for decades. The rent is very low, and she moves out, and the rent increase for a new tenant is less than 5%. And usually the apartment needs a lot of renovations when you've had a long-term tenancy like that. So what's happening is that landlords, and I have many clients in this situation, they decide to not rent the apartment because it's too expensive to renovate and there is no return. And I think they're hoping, maybe hoping against hope, that the legislature will change the law so that they would be able to get a better return. In addition to that, there used to be major capital improvement increases, so that's for boilers, windows, roofs, electrical systems, major systems. Basically, although it still exists on paper, as a practical matter, it does not exist, and so there's no return for that.
There are estimates that between 20 and 90,000 apartments, which could house people needing housing,
yes,
and also increase the supply
tremendously.
We have a housing crisis, and it seems as if, I mean, I really don't understand the taking away of the MCI, meaning that if I fix my building, if I repair my building, that I can recoup my costs by adjusting the rents. I think that that was a very logical solution.
It was, plus there was individual apartment increases where a landlord would, on a vacancy, would put in a new bathroom, a new kitchen. And obviously these things are quite expensive. But the landlord was able to get a return on that investment over a period of time through an increase in the rent. Again, although it technically exists on paper, as a practical matter, it simply does not exist. There is very, very few landlords who are taking advantage of that because the return is so low, the paperwork and the bureaucracy is so onerous that it's simply not worth it to many landlords. And it's very unfortunate. There's no question about it. We have a migrant problem in New York City. We have thousands of people who need apartments. And because of the inaction by the New York State legislature and the governor's office, that is the situation. It's brought about a very sad situation, a very bad situation.
I'm always an advocate of the mid-sized property owner. The mid-sized property
Sorry.
owner.
Oh,
Right?
thanks.
So, I do hear stories of, these hedge funds that are losing, 30, 40% of the value of their buildings. But really the point of the show here tonight and our base here in the New York City Hispanic Chamber of Commerce is basically mid-sized property owners such as yourself. And I hear these stories of, look, I did the right thing. I have voucher tenants. I don't income discriminate, right? But now my insurance is going up 30, 40%. I hear all kinds of scenarios that people who think it's a good idea or some type of legislation like taking away the MCIs or the internal increases in the rent. But I think that people have to understand that the landlords are also, it's us. It's people such as yourself and landowners who, I worked in a small business, I bought a 3-family, a 4-family, a 6-family, and now that's my retirement. And sometimes they come into my office and they're just petrified. Now lead paint is a very big issue. Now they're going to start going into your home and they're going to, have a laser gun that goes 5/8 into the wall. And you know what, that senior citizen that comes into my office and says, Gregory, English is not my first language, I'm not computer literate. Then they go online, they have to answer all these questions, they get intimidated and they get scared. And you know what, guess what? If they don't have the $20,000, $30,000, once they do find any amount of lead paint using the laser gun now, that goes 5/8 into the wall, then you know what, they're in a position where they're forced to sell. So if
they could find a buyer.
Okay, all right, so you know what, but like, I'll give you an example as a real estate broker, something I'm seeing that's very real, is that I did put a 2-family house on the market recently, right? I had 21, 22 people who were from the community who wanted to buy the house. And then I had 3 hedge funds, big money, coming in. Right now they were able, there was potential there because you could turn it into a 3, but you have to have deep pockets for that. There was potential there. And we ended up selling to the investor, who was basically paid $880 cash, no inspection, no real need for an appraisal because it's right, but also time of the essence. So with the rent stabilization funds that are not going into the bigger buildings, that money is shifting into, it's competing against now the mom and pops who, you know what, I want to buy a house for my children. So what I'm trying to express here is that there's a lot of legislation out there that they're trying to do the right thing, you're trying to protect tenants, but there's circumstances that are caused by trying to do the right thing that are detrimental, and they're hurting or even diminishing the property owner from actually buying a house for their family.
Well, and a good example of that is the rent stabilization only applies to buildings with 6 or more units. So if you're talking about a 2-family, and many 2-family buildings in whether it's the Bronx or Brooklyn or Queens, they are bought by a family of moderate means, and they need the rent from the tenant, from the other unit in the building, in order to pay the mortgage and pay for the upkeep of the premises. Right now, and for all these years, those rents have not been regulated. There are proposals in the legislature which would bring rent stabilization protection, you might say, to even a 2-family house. And that would have a devastating effect on small owners who are scraping by and trying to make ends meet. And one thing we haven't talked about is that the court system, if a tenant stops paying their rent, the delays in the court system are onerous, especially post-COVID, and it's another problem.
Okay, so let me just interject there. Now, you've been to housing court multiple times. You've been to housing court multiple times. I have a situation. Right, where the parents deceased, and now we're trying to sell the building, and in order to sell the building, we need legal possession of an apartment. Now, keep in mind, this is another small unit. It's a 2-family house, right?
Sure.
So they sent out the 90-day notice, and then I thought that this would basically be over. Now we could go to court. We could tell the judge we don't even know if he's up there. He hasn't paid rent in six months. This is the email that I got, because it's not just about the legislation, but also the process in order to get justice. So then the email that I got back from the L&T attorney was, what's next? I make a file to notice a petition. The court needs to issue an index, probably 2 to 3 more weeks.
Mm-hmm.
The court would maybe issue a court date anywhere from 1 to 4 months.
Mm-hmm.
On the first court date, often in the Bronx, they adjourn the case one time for anyone there to get an attorney.
It's automatic.
On the next court date, if one shows, if adjournment again, 1 to 2 months for an inquest. On the inquest date, depending on the judge, usually when you are awarded a judgment, but I would have to wait for the court date, all right? So it goes on and on. Then it says the warrant room then is 3 to 4 months behind. So now I have someone who inherited a property. We keep talking about intergenerational wealth. And we're dealing with almost a year and a half of it sitting on the market.
Yep.
Hopefully, you know, they have the funds to cover the mortgage if there's a mortgage, right? And it's a lot to do with the backup in the court system. So I'm going to ask you, first of all, or I'm going to ask you, is this true? Does it take a year and a half, even to basically take possession of an apartment that might be vacant? Have you had experiences where you wished, you know, I'll abide by the law, but it's not just the law, it's the process in order to get justice for a landlord?
It could actually be longer than this because you only got up to the part where they're actually issuing the warrant. Once the warrant is issued, the tenant is issued an eviction notice, or in your case, it's probably a squatter or whatever the case may be. At that point, they still have the right to go file what's called an order to show cause, and then a judge usually signs off on at least 1, maybe 2 of those. Or more, proceeding, making the process even longer. Now, let's say you do get your eviction and you do take possession, they also have the right to file what's called a post-evict order to show cause. Am I correct?
Absolutely.
And so they basically have, a judge has said, hey, you know what, the owner of this property has taken back legal possession, but you have come to me with sufficient enough reason for me to say that you may be able to be placed back in that apartment. I can give you a perfect example. I was working with a property owner in the process of selling their property. She actually was awarded an eviction for a tenant that owed her well over $25,000. The tenant was evicted, and you have to wait 30 days before you can remove the property from that apartment. On the 29th day, tenant filed a post-evict order to show cause. Judge says, okay, we're going to give you 14 more days. Day 13, he shows up again. Now they issued him another 14 days. So now this owner only has a certain amount of income coming in, and she's struggling to make those mortgage payments. If she doesn't borrow money or take money from a personal account or something of that nature, she could lose that property. And I think something that we touched on a little bit, you touched on a little bit, is with the mid-size owners, once you get to 6 or more, not only is it rent stabilized, but now you are subject to the banking system, which are commercial lenders. Commercial lenders, much different than residential lenders. Your typical residential lender, it's a 30-year fixed rate that you know what your payments are going to be. With commercial mortgages, those usually reset either every 5, 7, or 10 years, meaning that you're really subject to the condition of the market. So for example, a lot of those vacancies that you were talking about earlier and a lot of the problems that we're facing is because a lot of these owners' loans are coming due in the next 12 to 24 months because of inflation, because everybody was spending money and whatever the case may be, their properties, they're not able to refinance. So if you owe, let's just say you owe $900,000, your property right now, the bank will only give you $700,000. So you have to come to closing with $200,000. If not, you have to turn those keys in. On those smaller properties, also, a lot of times they ask for personal guarantees. So not only does it affect your business, but now it affects any other money that you've been able to save over the course of your entire career because of the fact that you have these banks, which, love them or leave them, people just don't understand the way the commercial lending works.
Well, we've also seen commercial banks that are dominant here in the Bronx for commercial properties
go out of business.
Go out of business.
Exactly.
Signature Bank is one example.
New York Community is on the rocks, and there was another one. Absolutely. Just to add to what Steve was saying, a lot of the buildings, whether they're small or medium or large, were bought prior to 2019 and prior to COVID. At that time, the interest rates were very low, and people bought the buildings with the expectation that under the law that existed prior to 2019, they would be able to improve their buildings, which employs a lot of people. You have to bring in craftsmen, plasterers, electricians, plumbers, etc. And that is basically working class people. So that was what happened prior to 2019. After 2019, and then you had COVID a few months after the passage of the new law in June of 2019. Then you had March 2020 COVID. Basically the bottom has fallen out. Landlords who predicted that they could increase the amount of rent that was coming in based upon the old law, that no longer exists. So as Steve was saying, the mortgage is coming due, and they simply don't have the money in order to do that. And what you also have is that the landlords don't have the money to renovate the buildings. Again, these are buildings built before 1974. Many of the buildings are 100+ years old. Buildings have to be renovated. They need new elevators. They need new electrical systems, plumbing systems, etc. And it costs a lot of money, a new roof. Where is that money going to come from? It comes from the rent. And it simply doesn't exist anymore. So you're going to have, as Steve said, foreclosures. The landlords aren't going to pay the taxes. Are you going to have a situation where the city of New York assumes thousands of buildings, just like the 1970s when buildings were just boarded up, and it was a terrible situation in the Bronx.
Which is another thing, because are we going back to the days? I mean, we see a lot of problems.
That's the fear.
And you know what? I was born in the South Bronx on Sherman Avenue. You are from the Bronx originally. Northwest Bronx. We moved from Sherman Avenue, due to the changing times, due to violence, basically, to be honest with you, back in the days. I remember when I first got in the business, we would sell co-ops on the ground level along the Grand Concourse when I had 30% of all the sales, because nobody even knew where the Grand Concourse was, and people actually would have plexiglass as bulletproof
on their windows.
On their windows.
And then they painted plants in the windows.
But what I'm saying is that
to answer your question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You asked the question, are we going back to those days? I want to just say that it's a very real possibility, because as you stated earlier, it's not just the legislation, it's also the process. It's also the fact of that crime is, I don't necessarily know the stats, whether it's on the rise or not, but people don't know, and somebody's home should be their safe house. And I am not here to say that tenants don't deserve to have affordable housing. That is absolutely a something that they need in their lives, but there has to be a balance. And I think the main thing that has to happen is there has to be more discussion between the policymakers and the people that are actually affected by these legislations that are coming down, because it seems as though a lot of the legislation that comes down is extremely one-sided, and people who have worked their entire lives to become property owners and to do things for their families are being punished for the mistakes of generations in the past. So I just think that the dialogue needs to be happening, and it needs to be happening on a more frequent basis.
Well, the word that you used is very true, balance. In Albany sets the rent laws for New York City and the rest of the state. They are not set down here in New York City. Many years ago, Albany assumed that role, and that is where the rent laws are made. There is no balance in Albany any longer. Since 2018, the Democrats control the Senate, the Assembly, and of course the Governor's Mansion. So there is no balance. And that is what resulted in the 2019 rent laws, which are completely unbalanced. I'll just give you a real quick anecdote. In the Westchester Rent Guidelines Board, we have public hearings. The landlord came and testified right at the time that the 2019 laws were passed. And he said, I ordered 3 new elevators for 3 different buildings. And I called up the elevator contract today, and I canceled all of those 3 new elevators. So what is the landlord going to do? They're going to use a Band-Aid approach. They're not going to replace it, even though it needs to be replaced. They're just going to say to the contractor, just patch it up, just do something. And of course, that's going to result in more breakdowns. And it's not to the tenant's benefit whatsoever. And whether it's an elevator or a roof or an electrical system, a boiler, That is the current state of the situation, and it's bad.
Which are the MCIs? I'm sorry, those are the MCIs that you're talking about that they eliminated.
Those are, yeah.
And the MCIs, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you would know. The MCIs, to my understanding, is if you replace a building-wide system, a boiler, an elevator, a roof, windows for the whole building, it's not like the cost is 100% on the tenants. They're able to take a percentage of that cost and then spread it out over the course of years.
Over many years,
so
exactly.
a tenant's rent might go up $25, but now they have a brand new elevator. They've got guaranteed no problems with heat and hot water. These are things that are affecting quality of life that they've now stripped away by just attacking and saying, it's like, okay, landlord is now such a negative word, and we need to work to get that back to be
this. You know what?
Not
This is part of the dialogue as to why I'm coming here and we're all here today, because you know what? 2019, we knew that there was going to be negative outcomes from this, and I do want to say that I did speak to a Democratic senator at the time, and he said part of the reason that it passed so easily was because at that time Cuomo was under the most extreme pressure due to some issues that he was dealing with up in Albany. So you know what? A lot of these laws have been looked at, but let me just finish up because there's another something was sponsored by Comrie and Kenny Burgos. All right, and I got 45 seconds. So it's called the Local Regulated Housing Restoration Adjustment Act. So we got like 30 seconds really, but that's something I want to put out there. That's a way that basically, could you explain that to us quickly if you don't mind?
Well, I think that's with, there could be increases when you have vacancies. That's certainly the landlord organizations such as CHIP and RSA have been looking for a meaningful way to increase it, but with many protections for the tenants.
Okay.
But it would improve.
We've got 10 seconds.
It's not that. That is a proposal, and it's unlikely to be passed in Albany. And what the actual result is of legislation that's passed and signed by the governor, just have to wait and see.
Okay. All right. So I just want to say thank you for your time.
Thank you.
I hope that we expressed ourselves, and I hope this becomes part of the dialogue. And I look forward to prudent legislation from our legislative officials. And I just hope that you know, we do the best we can in order to provide the best housing for the people who live in our borough, our city, and our state. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Once again, for more on Gregory Tsougranis, Elliot J. Cherson, and Steve Paternak, email them at teamtsougranis@gmail.com, ajc@rhcrlaw.com, and smprealty@gmail.com. Visit their social media on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. You may also visit their websites. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. I want to thank our guests, Gregory, Elliot, and Stephen, for joining us, and our viewers for tuning in and checking us out. Keep following on BronxNet TV for more continued coverage. If you're not a member of the New York City Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, you can always visit us and sign up. You can always engage with us as well on LinkedIn and at the New York City Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. All spelled out, New York City Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. I'll see you next time for another episode of Meetings of the Mind in partnership with BronxNet. See you next time. Ciao, ciao.